I've written a number of books before now, but this is the first one I've written under two different names. Two names which both appear on the cover of the book and on the title page: JC and James Campbell. James Campbell I can tell you a little bit about. My other books include a biography of James Baldwin, a history of the Beat Generation, and a travel book, Invisible Country, about a journey through Scotland, where I was born, brought up, worked and studied in both Glasgow and Edinburgh, and eventually started writing for the Times Literary Supplement in London. And that's where JC comes in. JC appeared more or less every week in the TLS for over 20 years as the author of the NB column. He never wrote anything else, but he appeared in the TLS every single week, and probably, it's fair to say this, JC is probably the most voluminous contributor to the TLS in its entire 120-year history. I haven't checked that, but I think it must be true. It's from those weekly columns that the contents of this book are drawn. Now, if you had the entire run of NB, it comes to something like 1.5 million words, which is twice the length of War and Peace. And I'm sometimes tempted to say I could have written War and Peace instead, twice, but I didn't. It gives us why under a pseudonym, why under a set of initials? Well, it gives a certain freedom to an author to write under a nom de plume. It wasn't a secret that it was me, but it's a certain disguise, it's a mask at a party. And it leaves the person behind the mask free to behave in ways that they wouldn't behave perhaps in everyday life. And in the case of written work, to say certain things that they wouldn't necessarily say in their other life. In other words, JC could say things that James Campbell wouldn't necessarily have written in other types of writing. And over time, JC developed a tone of voice entirely of his own, which, writing under my own name, in the Guardian or the New Statesman or something like that, I didn't imitate. I didn't write like JC. JC only wrote in one way, and that was on the back page of the TLS. But obviously we were collaborators, and we had fun writing this column, JC and I. And if someone were to ask me what was the main intention in writing this column week by week, I would say it was to create fun. It was to give pleasure. It was to provide entertainment to the reader. And readers wrote to me with comments, with suggestions, with complaints, sometimes justly. And I tried to reply to everyone and to cement the bond between the writer and the reader. That was also a great source of pleasure to me. And I used to say that the battery charge of the column came from readers, and my understanding that the column was being was being read in different parts of the world, week after week. And somehow that was the raison d'etre of it all. But just on the subject of entertainment, I like to think that I adopted what Sir Walter Scott wrote to a young writer in Edinburgh who asked him for advice. And Sir Walter said, "Don't be boring." That's about the best advice you can give to any writer. It wasn't always fun. On at least 2 occasions, JC was threatened with legal action. And that isn't fun at all. The first time was rather silly, I think, and was settled quite easily. But the second occasion was more serious, and some of you may recall the Orlando Figes affair, in which Figes, the historian, wrote reviews on Amazon of rival books by rival historians. That in itself was a bit of silliness, but in exposing him in NB, we were threatened with ruin, really. I won't go into the tale now, but we wrote about it over several weeks in the NB column, and it's in the book. In addition, I, James Campbell, have written an introduction, which is a blend of TLS history and memoir, and several short chapters on the same lines distributed throughout the text. And these give a kind of behind the scenes feel. I've always liked that myself, a kind of behind the scenes atmosphere in writing. And that's what I try to do in the introduction and the short chapters. And one of the things I noticed, when they come together, these chapters are written in the first person singular, whereas JC always wrote in the first person plural. We did this, we did that. I don't quite know how that came about, that JC wrote with the royal we, but in any case it sets us apart, JC and me. And now we've come together for the first time to collaborate on this book, NB by JC, A Walk Through the Times Literary Supplement.